The webinar tonight is just about basically what the GAMSAT was like for me personally. And really it's just to give you guys an opportunity to ask any questions that you have about how the GAMSAT is going to go on the day, or for me specifically, just in terms of my score. But this is an hour is quite a long time for me to just talk about myself and what the GAMSAT was like for me. So if you do have any questions, please pop those in the Q&A or in the chat, and I'll do my best to answer them. Okay, I will jump in and get started. So I'm guessing the reason you're all at this webinar is that, this very impressive title, I got quite a high score in all the sections. That is true. We can, go into the specific numbers later, but kind of the general gist of what I'm going to go through is just kind of why I think that that was the case, and hopefully just a bit of how that might be applicable to you, if you're not feeling so confident. So this is me. My name's Katya. I'm a second-year medical student at ANU. I was a Fraser student in 2019 or 2020, one of the two. And I've been teaching GAMSAT and interview prep ever since then, so about 5 seasons. So the big thing of how did I get such a high score is kind of the short version is that I don't know. They don't really, they don't send you a sheet being like, here's the questions you got right, etc. So I don't even know that. I just have kind of some suspicions about what helped me along. And again, I'll give you guys kind of the quick version, and then really this is just an opportunity for you to ask any questions that you have or anything like that about your own strategies or what worked for me and that sort of thing. And so, what was GAMSAT like for me? I sat it once in September of 2019. It was quite a stressful day because this was back in COVID. This was back when they were still splitting up the GAMSAT into these for social distancing sort of COVID reasons, they were splitting the GAMSAT up over many days, 2 different sessions, all this kind of stuff. And I had to be in a different city. I sat the GAMSAT in Sydney and I had to be in Canberra on the night of the last day of the testing session. It was a 2-week block. And on the last day of that block, I had to be in Canberra. And so I was praying for any session other than the last one on the last day. I got the last session on the last day, so I did my exam, and then I had to drive 3 hours to Canberra that night. So I was very, very stressed the day of, but I had the afternoon session, which I would have preferred if it weren't for the fact that I had to be in a different city, just because it meant that I didn't have to change my sleep schedule. For the exam itself, kind of 2 big things that I wasn't really expecting. First thing is that I had quite a lot of spare time to check my work. I did some of my prep with Fraser's, and my experience was that their mock exams were pretty time pressured. I don't think I ever finished with much time to spare when I was sitting those. And so I wasn't really expecting this, but I did have a fair bit of spare time in section 1 and section 3 to check over my work, which I kind of did, but didn't really do. I wasted a lot of that time, which, obviously I don't recommend. In section 2, I didn't have any spare time whatsoever. I don't know anyone who does. Something I would say for all of you, just because you're Fraser students specifically, is that the GAMSAT was a fair bit less difficult and time consuming than the Fraser's mocks were. There was also kind of a bigger focus on logic than prior knowledge. So what we kind of do at Fraser's is we teach you a lot of background information. We do really emphasize that it's a logic test, but we give you a lot of background information, probably more than you need. And the actual exam tends to focus less on that sort of information than the mock exams that we give you, because the mock exams that we give you are kind of focused more on, training you at a harder level than you really need to be trained, I suppose you could say. And so going just kind of section by section, with section 1, I didn't really have a conscious strategy, and I'm going to go into a bit more kind of why things I think worked out, but this is still just sort of on the day what things were like. So while I was going through section 1, I didn't really have a strategy. I finished in about half the time allotted, and then I used the rest of that time to kind of check over a couple questions, and I mostly just wasted the rest of it. So not super great. In section 2, this was my most time pressed. I had 2 topics, as you will as well. I believe they were loneliness and conspiracy theories. So I wrote sort of an evolutionary psychology type approach for both of those with kind of like very hopeful tone about, this is the evolutionary function of loneliness, or this is the evolutionary reason why conspiracy theories gain so much ground, but those adaptations are useful for these reasons, et cetera, et cetera. As far as sort of the specific breakdown, I spent 5 or 10 minutes planning both of my essays, and then I spent the rest of the time writing just as fast as I could without doing any editing. And then the last section, section 3, I was mostly focused on making sure I didn't make little mistakes, because that was something I'd noticed when I was doing my mock exams, is most of my marks were lost on things like forgetting to read the not that was in the question, or missing a unit conversion or something like that, right? So I was focusing on not doing so many of those little mistakes. I went through the paper with that in mind. I finished with about an hour to spare, I believe, with section 3. And then I used that time sort of similar to section 1. I went over a few questions I wasn't sure about, and then I just kind of wasted the rest of the time having a nap because I knew I needed to drive later. So jumping into why I think I did well. And again, if you guys have any questions at any point, just chuck them in the Q&A and I'll stop and go through them. But if there's not sort of any questions about what the day was like, I'll just go into the next sort of part of it, which is why I think that I did well in section 1. Because section 1 is pretty notorious for, you get the high marks are much lower than the high marks in, say, section 3. So I think that the reasons that I did well in section 1 were a couple of things, and they weren't super related to GAMSAT prep directly. So I think there were kind of 3 things going on. One of them is probably sort of at this late stage transferable, and the other 2 kind of aren't. So the first one is that I've been a very voracious reader since I was very, very little. That means that I read very quickly and I have a lot of exposure to different types of written material, and that made me much more comfortable with all the text on the day. So just that sort of baseline level of familiarity made it so that it wasn't so stressful for me to go through the text, and I also wasn't really put off by any of the styles because I was quite used to the styles. And so there was none of that sort of distraction factor if I haven't read anything like this before. Next thing is that I previously, as you can probably hear by my accent, I'm American. And so I was, back when I was a teenager, I thought I was going to go to university in America. And so I prepared for the US SAT exam, which is the exam that students take at the end of high school to, and they get a mark that kind of like a, whatever it's called here, the rank, the ATAR, helps determine what university you go to. So I sat that exam, I did some prep for that exam, and it's got a reading comprehension section that's quite similar in style to section 1. So even though it wasn't strictly in a GAMSAT context, I'd done a fair bit of prep on this type of thing, right? So I was quite used to the style of question, even though I hadn't done a lot of prep for section 1 specifically. I had something that was very, very transferable. So that's probably what I would say is most applicable to you guys, is there is some value to, to just doing practice questions and getting used to the style of things, because that sort of degree of familiarity is really going to help on the day when you're, panicking because it's exam day, right? And then the last thing is kind of a sort of more abstract thing, which is that I moved around a lot when I was a kid. And so I'm quite used to, I had to become quite used to recognizing, if this makes sense, the shared assumptions that people have in communication. And that is very, very prominent in written text. That's where a lot of implication comes from, is you and whoever is writing the passage have to share some assumptions, or at least you have to be aware of the assumptions that the writer is expecting you to make. That's where implication comes from. So I'm going to pause here because I can see I've got a question in the chat. So I've got someone asking, I didn't really use my spare time wisely in section 2 and section 3, but how would I recommend that you guys do use your spare time? I find if I have spare time, I recheck questions and sometimes second guess myself and change my answer. What would be the best way to avoid this? So that's kind of 2 questions in one. First thing is, how do I recommend that you use your spare time? A couple of things. First thing is, don't waste your spare time. But I do find that having little sort of 1-minute breaks to reset when you can feel yourself getting tired is quite helpful. It doesn't need to be long. It just needs to be a minute of you, singing to yourself or whatever, just to have a bit of a reset. And I know that it's quite easy, especially when you're used to these really sort of time pressured mock exams that we give you, to think, oh, I don't have time for that. But the quality of your reasoning is just much better when you've had just a little short break to reset yourself. So I recommend, first of all, doing that. Second of all, honestly, if you've gone through and you're fairly confident in your logic for all the questions, you're confident and you've worked them through properly, I don't really see much of a downside to just sort of, having a read, having a rethink, and making sure that you're happy with that thought process, but not sort of redoing the entire question, if that makes sense. Because I do know what you mean about, rechecking questions, second guessing yourself and changing your answer. I think there's a couple things going on there. First thing is, I don't know if you have some sort of like number analysis from the question bank or something that tells you that most of the time you're changing your answer from the right one to the wrong one, but there might be a bit of confirmation bias going on there, right? Where you're kind of, the times when you had the right answer and you change it to the wrong one kind of stick out to you more. So that might be something. But if you are, finding that you are frequently changing right answers to wrong ones, it's quite difficult. Perhaps what I would recommend there is, as you go through sort of your practice exams, trying to, and this is very abstract, I'm not sure how helpful this is going to be, but trying to develop a feel the first time around for when you're unsure versus when you have sort of too much time and you're expanding to fill that time. Because in a case where the first time you went through the question you were unsure, you're much more likely to, the second time around, to come to the correct answer rather than change away from it. Whereas if you just go back over something for the sake of going over it, then you're much more likely to start second guessing yourself when you shouldn't be. So I guess that's what I would say, is when you're in a situation where you where you have time to go back over questions, that's fantastic, but I would perhaps limit it to questions where you were unsure the first time around. And I believe they do have a flag function in the actual exam, so that you can flag questions that you're unsure about the first time and then only come back and do those questions afterwards. That would probably be my strategy. Okay, just getting along to section 2, and keep those questions coming if you do have them. So for section 2, again, why did I do well? I do not know. What I think is that I've had, like I said, I've read a lot of stuff in a lot of different areas, including nonfiction, and that meant that whatever essay topic they chucked at me, there was a very good chance that I'd read not just one, but several things that I could relate back to it. So loneliness and conspiracy theories, for example, I didn't go in specifically, having read stuff about either of those things. I didn't really have a strong focus in evolutionary psychology in my degree or anything else. I just happened to have read a fair bit of psychology stuff because I found it interesting. And that happened to be relevant to the essay topics that I was given. And that let me write a very sort of well-reasoned, concise essay because I was drawing on logic that other people had kind of already laid out for me, right? I wasn't coming up on my own with all of the evolutionary reasons why conspiracy theories or loneliness are, exist or are beneficial. I had read about those previously, and I was just kind of, giving them back with my own twist, right? And probably the important thing to note there is that that didn't only specifically apply to the two topics that I was given. Because I'd read so much different stuff, that was kind of going to be the case with pretty much anything they gave me. So I'm a big fan of everyone reading a lot of stuff because, I think reading is really valuable. But yeah, I think that's probably mostly what section 2 is coming from, is I had read a lot of stuff and therefore I had a lot of ideas to draw on for both of my essays. Next thing is, again, sort of that whole moving around a lot thing, that shared assumptions thing. That was quite valuable for section 2 because it made it much easier for me to lay out exactly sort of the train of thought that I was trying to convey in my essay. It also meant that, because I'd done all this moving around, because I'd had to do all this stuff of, why don't I understand what's happening in this conversation? Oh, because they're all coming from this sort of shared common place. That meant that I had to do a fair bit of kind of introspection. And so I had sort of this cohesive way of understanding the world already going into section 2. And that meant that I didn't have to sort of come up on the fly with what perspective I was going to take on any of these things, because it was kind of already there. Again, not to do with conspiracy theories or evolutionary biology or anything specifically, just sort of in general, I knew the way that I thought about the world. And therefore I had sort of a, stable framework, if you want to say it like that, to draw on. And I think that's something that they teach you as well in the Fraser's section 2 tutoring. I'm not a section 2 tutor myself, I'm section 3, but I think they do teach you kind of, this is sort of a stable, coherent framework that you can use when you're writing your section 2 essays. So lean on that, I think, would be my advice as well. And then the last thing is that I like creative writing, and so I have some experience making my writing sound nice and structuring it well. So that probably saved me some time. And so kind of the big thing with section 2 is I had all of this stuff just sort of previously from my life that made it easy to come up sort of on the fly with something that was coherent and sounded good, because I wasn't coming up with all of it myself. I had stuff, stuff to draw on. And then the second thing is just, some basic stuff about making your writing well structured and sounding good. And again, that's something we give you in the section 2 tutoring. So I can see a couple more questions. So someone's asking, how did you go about preparing for the exam for section 2 beyond reading widely? So great question. I didn't. My prep for the entire GAMSAT exam, like specifically for the GAMSAT exam, was limited to, I took, I believe, 3 mock exams to get used to the format, essentially. And that was it. That was all that I did. So I didn't do any specific prep for section 2. But again, the US SAT had a kind of a similar thing, right? Which is, write some essays and all that. And I would contend that high school English in Australia teaches you a very similar thing. So I had some practice writing essays from both of those. And that was as far as my section 2 prep went, really. All right, then the other one, how did you approach / structure your essays? So as far as structuring it, I kept it fairly simple. I didn't have, as I'm sure you guys know by now, you don't have really a lot of time to plan in section 2, so you have to kind of make it up as you go. But I tried to keep it sort of, here's an intro of what I'm going to talk about and my basic conclusion. So for conspiracy theories, I think it was something like, conspiracy theories cause a lot of harm in the world. They're, the source behind a lot of, mistrust in the government, and that has a couple of bad consequences in terms of, health and following public policy, et cetera, et cetera. It's also the root behind a lot of extremist crimes. But the evolutionary reason why conspiracy theories take such root is because people want to feel in control, and thinking, or people like the idea that there is someone in control and makes them feel like, things have meaning, things happen for a reason. And if things happen for a reason, that means that you have some control over your own life. So it's a very comforting idea. And, then I kind of expanded a little bit on both of those points that kind of said about how it's, a motivation for a lot of bad stuff. And then I went kind of in more depth about why it's sort of a comforting idea. And then I wrapped up saying, yes, conspiracy theory is not the best thing to believe, but it's rooted in this evolutionary need to feel in control. And so if we help people feel safer by doing X, Y, and Z, social support type things, then that will, help reduce the sort of consequences of these things. And if we show compassion for people who have been taken in by conspiracy theories, because it's really coming from a place of insecurity and blah blah blah. So that was kind of the actual sort of structure of it. Was just a quick intro of here's what I'm going to talk about, expand on each of the ideas that I laid out in that intro, and then wrap up with some kind of a summary plus like a hopeful, like here's maybe something that we can do to improve things, right? As far as the approach, I guess, because in my opinion, that's kind of like a slightly different question. My approach for both of those was evolutionary psychology, specifically because I found that it let me write something that I thought was interesting, and also that I, happened to know a lot about, and so I could, kind of expand as much as I needed to fill the space. um, and yeah, so I suppose what I would say there is don't overcomplicate it on the structure. Just keep it sort of basic intro. Here's what I'm going to talk about. Bam, bam, bam. Here's what I've talked about. Here's maybe like a hopeful note for the future. And as far as the contents, keep it something that you know a lot about. So most of them, you can't completely hijack it to a completely different topic, but they're designed to be able to be approached from a number of different directions. So pick a direction that's to your strength, right? That gives you a lot to talk about, that you're comfortable talking about, that that you sound like you know what you're talking about. That would be kind of too general piece of advice, I suppose. Someone's asking, did you use a lot of real life examples / quotes when explaining your points in each paragraph? So I referred to, I'm trying to remember. I think I gave 1 or 2 supporting examples, certainly no more than 2 for each essay. And it would have been quite brief. It would have been, just an example of an extremist crime that was motivated by a conspiracy theory, something like that. A lot of what I was talking about was kind of researchy stuff, so I didn't cite papers, you know what I mean? I just kind of talked about it in this very general sense of it is thought that, type of thing, because I didn't have, references on me. Quotes I would have done if it were different topics. I'm a big fan of Martin Luther King quotes specifically, especially for the type of social justice-y type things that tend to come up in section 2. But I don't think I used any in either of the essays that I actually wrote. Someone else asking, did you reference any materials, books or articles for your arguments? No. So again, sort of in general terms, I was like, research says, but I didn't give any names of authors or studies or anything like that. Alrighty, so scooting along to section 3. Why did I do well in section 3? Again, I do not know. What I think is that I was, first of all, part of the Australian Biology Olympiad national team. So that's just that's a competition, a biology competition. Each country has a national team, and then you all go off to compete. I was on the Australian team in 2017. So that was several weeks of daily 9 to 5 biology training, followed by the actual competition itself. So that was really, really intensive training in science. The Olympiad exam is quite similar to section 3 in that it kind of relies on you applying logic to systems that you haven't seen before. There is a bit more, or a lot more, expected knowledge in the Olympiad than in section 3, but the underlying format was very, very similar. So I had really, really extensive training on how to do section 3. It was just in a slightly different context, right? And I mean, when I say extensive, I mean extensive. Like there's no way that you can have several weeks of 9 to 5 training on how to do exactly this, except in, basically if someone's forcing you, right? In a context like this. So training, really, really valuable. Whatever amount of training you can do, it doesn't have to be this much. It happened to be this much for me because it was related to this, completely other thing that I did, but practice does help. So next thing is that my undergraduate degree was in science. That certainly helped, not because it gave me, not assumed knowledge, not that it gave me background knowledge that helped me so much with specific questions, but just because it was several years of training, again, of how to think scientifically, and sort of what types of assumptions, I suppose, are expected or okay to make when you're looking at a scientific system. It's kind of the way to approach it, I guess, is what my science degree gave me. And then finally, I've got some math training as well. I've got a mathematics minor for my undergraduate degree, and that made it a lot easier for me to do the sort of simple level of maths that they expect you to do in the GAMSAT. It also, I think once or twice, I could use something like a derivative to get me out of a trickier situation and a problem that would have taken a long time otherwise. So those are kind of the three things that were going on in section 3. So kind of the takeaways from all of that for you guys are, first of all, that you'll notice that I was saying sort of a lot of things that started a long time ago. So it doesn't have to be this extreme to be valuable. Like I was starting several years before some of these experiences that I was talking about. But sort of the earlier you start, the easier it's going to be. Just some low level of prep all the time is quite useful to getting you to this point. So it's a marathon, not a sprint. Next thing, practice is quite valuable, even if it's not in exactly a GAMSAT context. It still is quite helpful, right? So practically none of the preparation that I did was actually for the GAMSAT specifically. It was for these other things. It was for the Olympiad, it was for the SAT test, but it was all kind of the same skills. And the GAMSAT is a skills exam. So that practice, even if you are thinking, oh, crap, I haven't done enough GAMSAT prep specifically, if there are other experiences that you've had or other tests that you've taken that use those same skills or the same format, that's going to help you here as well. Next thing is read a lot, think about what you read. I will toot this horn until I die. It's just valuable, not even just for the GAMSAT, just generally, it's going to be quite useful when you're trying to approach problems from multiple sides. And that's something you're going to have to do in medical school. They have ethics classes where you have to look at different sides of things. And then lastly, you don't have to do everything right to do well in the GAMSAT. I really should have done more prep. I really should have. I should have used my time better in the exam. Yeah. And despite all that, I came out of it perfectly fine. I should have done the tests on a day where I didn't have to drive to a different city. I should have just copped so that I couldn't drive to Canberra, even though I really wanted to be there. And I didn't do that. But despite all of that, it came out okay. So everything doesn't have to go perfectly. In fact, the day itself can be quite a disaster, and you can still come out having done okay. So just, I suppose, on the day and leading up to the day, just try and keep that in mind. It doesn't have to be perfect to get you over the line. All right, so let's asking sort of last minute tips to prepare for the next few weeks. Saying, we can't really change things, the reading or the specific training. Yeah, that's fair enough. So mindset tips are small things you can include in your study. Probably what I would say is the most valuable thing for the last couple of weeks, certainly what I did for the last couple of weeks, is I deliberately gave myself some time away from GAMSAT prep. Because I'm not saying like go lie on the couch, but what I am saying is that you don't want to get burned out before you even get there. And I was quite conscious of that starting to happen to me in the last couple of weeks. So I know it's a stressful time, but do make sure you're building in enough time off to not come to the day feeling stressed out and already exhausted, right? You want to be some degree fresh. It's the same sort of principle as marathon runners, right? Like they train really, really hard in the months before, and then the last couple of weeks, they really ease off quite considerably. So they're really fresh and ready to go on the day of the actual event. So that's one thing. Another thing, I suppose, is, and I'm not sure if this will be helpful for you, this is kind of what was helpful for me, is I find it helps me get out of a panic. And you're going to be dealing with that, right? Of course, it's GAMSAT, you're going to have some sort of panic on the day or leading up to it. I find it helps me get out of a panic if I kind of take this whole like Murphy's Law approach of like, oh yeah, of course it's going wrong. Like everything always goes wrong, and just kind of like laugh about it instead of getting like panicky about it. I think that's very specific to me, though. I'm not sure how well that will go for anyone else. Other than kind of building in adequate time off and trying to, whatever you've found works for you to sort of reduce your panic levels. Other things I would say are really going over that basic math for section 3. That's really, really helpful. Basically, whenever you do it, just keeping that all really fresh in your mind, because it will definitely come up. And there's kind of no way around it. Not focusing at this stage too much on any other than math, because you're going to need the math, but not focusing on any specific knowledge that you think you've missed out on, because that's just sort of like a never-ending well that you can go down into and panic yourself. It's much more valuable at this stage to take sort of a step back from the specific knowledge and focus more on the kind of skills-based things that you've been learning. So tackling questions, even if you're not totally sure about the underlying knowledge, right? So using the question bank for that, really. Next one, how did you navigate through section 3 topics that looked foreign, and how did you get almost an hour to spare? Do you think you had more time pressure than you needed, and that's what drove you to go as quick? So as far as navigating through section 3 topics that looked foreign, trying to recall some specific examples. I think mostly the way that I did it was, again, just because I kind of had seen a lot of it before, I wasn't super phased by it. So probably the number one thing is just kind of keeping that panic down to a minimum and keeping your head. Because even if I didn't know what was going on, the fact that I wasn't panicking, that I was calm, made it quite easy to be like, okay, well, I must have all the information that I need right here in front of me. Like, let's make a quick list of what do I know? How can I get to any of these answer options? Where to, if this is talking about such and such a thing, where do they mention that? And just kind of, going through it in that very sort of methodical way. That would be sort of my general approach for anything that I wasn't too sure about. I think the only thing that really tripped me up in section 3 was there was this big funky table full of numbers that I just could not get my head around. I think my approach for that was I tried to read around the table as much as I possibly could, the spare information and all of that, and that kind of worked. So, and I'm sure everyone has some experience in some question where they had something they just couldn't get their head around, they had to read around it. Ideally, you won't have to do that so much, but it is, a valuable skill to have if you do come across it. So that's another thing. How did I manage to get almost an hour to spare? I don't know. I went through the questions at what I thought was a pretty reasonable pace. I wasn't particularly trying to rush. I think I skipped over one set of questions, so probably 4 or 5 questions total, all to do with that big funky table that I mentioned, and I came back to that at the end. But other than that, I just kind of went through the paper like start to finish. And I like I said, I went back to check things I wasn't sure about, but I wasn't particularly trying to rush it. So I'm not sure. I think I just read quickly, and the math really helped me out. I think you are probably right. It did also help that I wanted to get out of there. But they wouldn't let me out, and I knew that they weren't going to let me out. So it kind of, wasn't to my benefit to be rushing through things. Because I wasn't going to get let out no matter what I did. So someone's asking, in your time off, what can we do? Like just watch Netflix, completely different tasks like uni. Yeah, just whatever takes your mind off of it. If doing uni stuff isn't going to burn you out, like personally, that would just burn me out. But if it's not going to burn you out, then go ahead and do that. I was, when I was taking time off, I was just kind of, being a potato in bed, reading something or watching something or whatever. And again, I'm not saying do that all the time. I'm just saying you have to build in enough time that you actually feel refreshed at the end of it. Someone else going, did you use any GAMSAT prep courses? And just wondering how you got access to the 3 practice exams. So I did 3 mock exams with Fraser's. I didn't do any like prep courses other than that, if that makes sense. So the 3 mock exams I think technically counted as a prep course, but it was just the exams. There weren't any classes or anything associated with that. I don't think for the SAT I did any classes either, but I did do I spent a fair bit of time prepping with my dad for that one. So yeah, for the practice exams, that was just through Fraser's. Yeah, no, definitely. You can feel quite guilty taking time off, but it's extremely necessary. And it's also a good skill to learn now, right? Because when you get into medical school and you have, you can have that thought like every second of your life if you let it take over, right? Oh, I should be doing more because one day, like, this is going to kill a patient if I don't, like, right? It can get really extreme. um well, honestly, the main thing that helped me, and for anyone who can't see this, someone's just saying they feel quite guilty taking time off, but they know it's important, and they're asking how to not feel guilt. um so first thing I would say is it's very, very common among perfectionists, right? And anyone who's aiming for medical school is at least a little bit of a perfectionist. So that's the first thing, is you're not alone. You're going to be in very, very good company in that. And it's a perfectly normal way to feel, right? That's part of what's driving perfectionism, is some degree of guilt, right? That if you don't do well, then you're not a good person, or you're not worthy, or whatever. Um, so that's going to be part of it. Like, just recognizing that is probably helpful, or it was helpful for me. And the other thing is that you can't be the best at whatever you're doing if you're constantly like burning the candle at both ends. So, we're all trying to get into medical school. So I'm going to talk about medical school. So specifically for medical school, just as an example, but you can apply this to anything. If I run myself absolutely ragged, in the first month, so it's still the first month of classes for us. If I run myself absolutely ragged, learning everything about the musculoskeletal system and every exam and every disease that can possibly affect it and blah 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 blah, then I'm not going to have any energy left to learn about the next system, right? And that doesn't actually make me a better doctor, for me to run myself ragged at the start and then just not have the energy to do the next thing properly. Even if I'm trying to run at 100% the whole time, it's just, it's physically not possible. It's mentally not possible. And it's not actually helpful to you or to anyone to be running yourself ragged all the time, because you come out the other end and you actually, haven't learned more because of it, right? Or you haven't done more because of it. It's just that you had this big burst at the start and then you kind of ran out of steam at the end. So that was quite helpful for me, is thinking, yes, I'm feeling this sort of impulse to do everything that I possibly can right now, but that's an impulse. My brain is trying to help me, but my brain is wrong right now, because I know logically that the thing that's actually going to help me the most, is going to help my future patients the most, is going to help, the med school the most, is if I take it at 80%, right? 80% all the way through. And just, leave 20% slack because things are going to come up, right? All of your life things are going to come up. So that's kind of how I would do it, is just keep in mind that your brain is trying to help you by giving you these sort of impulses, but that logically, that's not actually what's best. That's not actually what's the most helpful to anyone involved. And just trying to sort of rein it in that way. And it does take time. Okay, someone else asking, how do you recommend reading long stems and filtering out the important info without getting lost? So a couple things there. First thing is that long stems are getting much less common in the GAMSAT. They're focusing much more on sort of the shorter things. Second thing is that if you do run across a very long stem, I find it helpful to kind of, first of all, try not to absorb every detail from every paragraph. I find it helpful to sort of chunk it into, even the longest stems won't have more than like 4 paragraphs, right? Something like that, 5 paragraphs. So I just will give myself a little summary for each paragraph on my scrap paper of, here's kind of some keywords they mentioned, here's one sentence describing the whole paragraph. And then I've got a much shorter, more digestible sort of reference sheet, right? And instead of referring back to the whole big passage when I'm answering questions, I just refer back to that sheet. And then if I need more detail, then I'm like, okay, I can see I need to read paragraph 1 again, and then I only have to read 1 paragraph instead of the whole thing. So just taking some time at the start to make a little cheat sheet with keywords and a little summary sentence for each paragraph. Anyone else have any questions or concerns at all, or comments about anything? Someone's asking, any tips for the day? So what to eat, drink, etc. to calm down. So tips for the day is, first of all, I'm not sure if they're still splitting it into morning and afternoon sessions. If they are, there's not much you can do about which one you're allocated to, but adjust your sleep schedule ahead of time if you have the morning session, if you have the afternoon session like I did, or if they've gone back to sort of a more reasonable sort of 9 to 5 thing, then I know it's hard to not wake up super early, but there's no benefit whatsoever to waking up super early on exam day. Just have a nice little snooze. So that's one thing, especially because you will probably have been up the night before stressing about it. So that's one thing, is have a sleep in if you can. The other thing is I tried to just eat sort of normal meals before I got there. When I got there, I had to have sort of a, small dinner just because I couldn't bring a whole lot with me. But probably what I'd say in terms of that is just, bring plenty of snacks, because they do give you little snack breaks and it'll just help to keep you going. It'll help you not be so hungry from you're probably going to have a smaller meal than normal for at least one meal, right? And it'll just help you not be so hungry if you have snacks. And yeah, try and make them not like up and goes and things. Try and make them like fruit, and crackers that are going to take a bit longer to digest. Make sure you have plenty of water. You probably know that. Bring a sweater. I'm a very small person, and I get cold quite easily, and I do not like being cold, and I don't think anyone likes being cold. So just bring layers, wear layers that you can take on and off as you need to. Yeah, I find that it personally for me, it kind of soothes the anxiety a little bit if there's literally nothing that I have to do the morning of. And so, the night before, the sandwich was ready. It was in the fridge. I just had to grab it and go. All of my pens and everything were in a bag that was sitting on the kitchen counter, and all of that. So get all of that ready the night before, including your, ID and all of that. Having a look at the chat. So someone's asking if the recording will be available later. Yes, I believe so, but I will double check that when I get off. Just one session now. Don't know if you've already mentioned this, but do you get to take a calculator? So a calculator, no, unless they've changed things. I don't think they have. A whiteboard, kind of. You get scratch paper. So that kind of counts as a whiteboard. But no, you don't get a calculator. That's why we have such a big focus on mental maths during prep. Someone's asked what to do if you're reading an S1 text and you don't understand what it's about. So for example, interpreting poems. So that's quite difficult because poems are kind of by nature really, really open to interpretation. I suppose I would say focus as much as you can on the literal meaning first. So use your scratch paper, just make yourself a little sort of 1-sentence summary of the main character is doing this, and then see if you can get the emotion out of it. So the general tone of the poem, or the main character is feeling sad, or the poem sounds sad, or whatever. And if you can get those kind of first 2 layers, then even if you can't get the whole rest of the interpretation, that'll kind of mostly get you part of the way there. So that's probably what I'd say if you're really, really struggling, is first flag it and come back, give yourself some time to process. But if that doesn't work, then just try and get out sort of 1-sentence summary of what's actually happening and the tone or mood, and that'll get you a fair way closer. So I was asking how to think of good ideas for section 2. Well, I mean, they're kind of giving you the topic of the essay, right? So it's more about, before you get into the exam, thinking of what kind of general approach you're going to take to whatever they give you. Because even if you don't know the specific thing the specific topic they're going to chuck at you, they're all kind of social science-y type things, right? Policy. So just think of, a general approach that you're comfortable with for social science topics, for policy topics, for politics, that kind of thing. So I would just do it like that. Just think of the approach before you go in, and then they've kind of given you, hopefully, a lot of the actual sort of content in the prompt. in the chat. In the mock tests, I find that when I get to section 3, I get tired and foggy. How do I re-hype myself during the exam and get energy? So again, that's quite difficult. There is an element of just the exam is designed to fatigue you, right? Probably my best tip for rehyping yourself is, like I said, little 1-minute breaks. They don't have to be long, but one actual full minute, not 10 seconds, one full minute of you thinking about something pleasant that's not the exam. Like for me personally, that worked quite well. I don't think they let you just kind of stand up randomly, which is kind of the other thing that I used to do in exams to kind of like help wake myself back up, is just like do some movement. But yeah, if you can, whatever amount of movement you can do, or just taking a little short break and thinking about something pleasant that's not the exam. And then finally, someone's asking what scores I got. So I got for section 1, 82, for section 2, an 87, and for section 3, a 94. So all up, that was an 89 overall. What score should you aim for to be competitive? It seems like above a 70 will get you somewhere. Different schools are different, right? So above a 70 gives you pretty good fighting odds to get in somewhere. I think probably above 75, I would be quite surprised, unless there was something else badly wrong somewhere else, if you didn't get in somewhere, right? But if you're aiming specifically for, say Flinders and you're a non-Flinders graduate, like Flinders has an extremely high bar for non-Flinders graduates. So it depends what school, but 70, 75 would be quite safe, in my opinion. And you can certainly get in with something in the 60s. Okay, anyone else have any questions, concerns at all? Do you find group study effective? So for medical school, yes, I do. More just, it's kind of depends what you mean by group study. It's useful in medical school just to have like friends around for you to be like, hey guys, does the spinocerebellar tract do this? Without having to look it up. But for GAMSAT, I didn't really do that as such, but different things work for different people. Okay, mentality for the day. I actually think it was quite helpful for me to have something else to stress about that wasn't the exam. I found it helpful to stress about, I have to be somewhere after the exam. So just whatever you can do to keep sort of the panic about the exam to a minimum. And something I find helpful if I am like actively panicking and I need to stop, excuse me, is to, and this is very nerdy, to recite the Litany Against Fear from the June novels, right? Because it's kind of long, it's like complicated enough that you have to focus on it, and that kind of gets you out of it. But everyone has kind of their own little things that help them when they're actively panicking. So just have to think about those, be ready with them. Yeah, other than that, just by the time it gets to the day, you've done what you can do. It's going to turn out however it's going to turn out, and stressing isn't going to help. And that, that usually doesn't fix 100% of my stress, but it certainly helps for me, at least, to not worry so much about, oh my God, what if everything goes wrong? Everything's not going to go wrong. You're 95% of what's going to determine your score has already happened by the time you get to exam day. So, whether you're having a good day or a bad day is going to make a difference of a couple of points, right? So just try and keep that in mind as well. Even if you are having a bad day, even if you come out of it and you're like, that was terrible, that was the worst it could possibly have gone, 95% of that already happened, right? 95% of it was already set. The last 5% of whether you had a good or a bad day, It's only 5%. Just try and think like that. Next thing is, how do you filter out the noise of other people's computers and people typing? It is very distracting. I agree. I believe they offered earplugs in my session. I didn't take them because I was too busy typing. But probably what I would say is, just for the next couple of weeks, that's another thing you can do, is go somewhere where people type a lot and it's really loud, and just get used to the noise. Because that's kind of like, that's your only two options, right? Block it out with earplugs or desensitize yourself. So spend some time desensitizing yourself if it, it's very bothersome to you. But something else I would keep in mind there is, I know it's like a convenient object to focus on, to be like, oh no, like it's the fact that I can hear other people typing that's screwing me up, but it's probably just like, section, exam taking like stress, right? And so I would try and keep that in mind as well, as like, whether I'm having a good day or a bad day, like whether people are being really loud or really quiet, like 95% of it already set. I don't need to stress too much about this last 5%. Like, yeah. Yeah, okay. Unless anyone else has any more questions. Yeah, no worries. Yeah, unless anyone else has any more questions, I think I might call it there. Best of luck to everyone. I will hang around for a couple of minutes until 8 p.m. if anyone does have any last minute things that they can think of. But otherwise, that's sort of the end of content, and everyone have a good night. Yep, I'll just chuck my email into the chat. Someone's just asked. Yeah, no worries, guys. Okay, someone's asking, how much did I write for section 2? I couldn't give you a word count. I just wrote as much as I had time for after I'd done my planning. That was 4 or 5 decent sized paragraphs. With my plan, how detailed was it? Not really detailed at all. It was just me kind of coming to a sort of coherent, like, this is the topic. Like, so for the conspiracy theories one, I think it was just a couple of sentences being like, conspiracy theory, like evolutionary basis, examples, can fix with social safety nets, like something like that, 3 sentences. How did I prep for physics? I had a math minor, so that was my prep for physics. Because physics, like, in my opinion, is just math. So, yeah. Did my essays come across as more argumentative or more reflective? I would, I think I would probably phrase it more as like a position paper, right? So if someone, like, it would be almost like if someone goes, hey, what's your opinion about conspiracy theories? You have 10 minutes to talk, or something like that, right? So it was more just me saying, here's what I think. All right, it's 8 p.m. guys, so I'm going to call it, but best of luck to everyone with all of your prep. And yeah, have a good rest of your nights. Someone's asking, last minute questions are popping up. Can you use first person for personal voice for section 2? I kind of steered away from it. I think it sounds less authoritative. I think it could probably be done well. It just would take more skill. Like, that's not really my personal style. I think it would take more skill than I have for that to come off sounding as good as a more sort of impersonal style. Okay, I'm going to call it there. Good night, and all the best.